Welcome to the NIA and NHLBI Entrepreneur Workshop Series. Today's topic is Investing Funding 1, Finding the Right Investor. So this is part of our Entrepreneur Workshop Series, co-hosted by the National Institute on Aging and the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. It's really designed to offer research entrepreneurs as well as biotech owners and small businesses and those who are interested to get really deep on some of the key components for startup success. We have been running these sessions since 2021 and will continue them through 2022. I also want to encourage you to visit our NIA Small Business Program website. We have quite the curriculum of content there on the archived events pages. And this is just a preview on this topic, and we understand that you may have some very specific questions. If you are an awardee of NIA and NHLBI, we invite you to participate in a more in-depth one-on-one conversation with an entrepreneur in residence, and we'll talk more about that later. So we do have another webinar coming up on investment funding part 2, and we encourage you to register for that today. It will be held on March 8th. As you'll see, we have some of the topics that we've covered in the past, from opportunity assessment to corporate governance, intellectual property, licensing. Those past workshops can be viewed on the National Institute on Aging Small Business Development website. So we're going to go through a welcome and really introduce you to some of our expert panelists, and then we'll have a moderated Q&A. Again, please enter your questions on the Q&A feature. My name is Monique Laroque. I'll be hanging around for the Q&A, and I do want to introduce you to our esteemed moderator, Dr. Diane Ignar.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We are very fortunate to have 4 expert panelists joining us today for this workshop. Just very briefly, my background was I was trained in neuroscience, but spent most of my career at GlaxoSmithKline, and more recently have been involved in the biotech sector. I joined NIA as an entrepreneur in residence in August, and I look forward to working with the companies that are being supported by the NIA. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves and then also share a bit of the perspective of the type of investor that they are representing. So Don, I'll go ahead and start with you.
Thank you, Diane. Don Rose here. I'm a venture partner with Hatteras Venture Partners. It is a early stage life science venture firm located in Durham, North Carolina. And it's currently investing out of its 7th fund. It's actually closing its 7th fund now. So it will be investing out of that 7th fund. It has about $800 million under management across all of those different funds. And we invest in early stage life science companies. About half the portfolio is in biopharma or pharma, biotech. And then the other half is split between medical devices, healthcare IT, diagnostics, tools, and those sorts of life science companies. Typically invest in the Southeast, but not exclusively, up and down the East Coast. And I think that probably covers it. In early stage life science investment is what we do.
Can we move on to, so Steve, if you could introduce yourself and maybe just talk a little bit about angels and family offices and that perspective, investor perspective.
Sure. So I'm Steve Flaim. I'm the investor in residence with the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. My background, I'm a cardiovascular physiologist by training. I started in academia, medicine, and physiology, moved on to large pharmaceutical companies for drug discovery, and then cycled into doing early stage companies and startups on the West Coast. And then I moved on to work with UCSD to develop the Von Liebig Center here in San Diego. And in the last 10 years, I really spent most of my time with NIH, but I'm also an angel investor with Tech Coast Angels here in Southern California. And I've been a board member for the Angel Capital Association. So I'm going to be representing here today the angel sector of investment. Diane.
Thank you. So can we move on then to Kuldeep?
Yes, Diane, thanks. My name is Kuldeep Neote, and I'm an EAR in the Seed NIH group. I'm trained as a molecular biologist, and I've spent 25 plus years in big pharma, 10 years at Pfizer, Eli Lilly, J&J Innovation. I started off in the discovery group, focused on small and large molecule drug discovery. And then in the last 7 years of my career in big pharma, I moved on to external innovation, initially doing search and evaluation in the area of oncology, and then moving on to a broader role with a focus on new co-generation, new co-formation, and maturation of biotech while I was at J&J Innovation in Boston. I am based in Boston now. I then moved to Lilly and focused on their venture initiative and interacted extensively with some of the venture partners that Eli Lilly had. In my last 4 years, I've left Big Pharma and taken on this EIR role, and I'm delighted to speak on this panel.
Thank you very much, Kuldeep. So Lolita.
Yes, hello everyone. It's a pleasure to serve on this panel today. I am Lolita Robinson. I'm entrepreneur in residence at NIH Seed Office, and I'm a physician by training, but I do not practice. I have over 20 plus years experience in point of care diagnostics and digital health. I've held a variety of chief medical officer, business development, and medical affairs roles at various biotech medical diagnostics companies, such as MedImmune Vaccines, which is now AstraZeneca, and others such as Thermo Fisher Scientific, which back when I was there, was called Thermo Electron. Along the way, I co-founded a medical company where we provided procurement, planning, and biomedical equipment, training services, and point of care diagnostic lab services to public and private entities throughout Africa. So I spent many years doing that. Most recently, I worked at Blue Cross Blue Shield, Nebraska as an entrepreneur in residence. And in that time, I sourced and evaluated healthcare products and digital health solutions for partnership and investment opportunities. I also worked with the hospital system to launch a small investment fund, as well as identify investment opportunities for them. So for today, I'll be offering the non-pharma strategic partnering perspective, particularly from a payer and hospital point of view. So we're always looking for chronic disease management, remote care, virtual care type of products and solutions. So I look forward to an engaging conversation today.
Great, thank you, Lolita.
Sure.
So I want to thank the audience for sending their questions. We had an extensive list of questions, and there are three main topic areas we're going to start with, and I've been able to fold many of the questions into those three main topics. It turned out that much of what the audience was interested in falls into the topics that we were going to cover. So that's really helpful. And so what we're going to be talking about today, first, the types of companies or technologies that each investor type is interested in. Then we'll move to timing. So at what stage are these investors typically investing? And then finally, we'll talk about outreach and investor strategy. So we're going to start off with the interest from the different investor types. And so I think I'd like to just ask each of the panelists. So let's start with Don, so venture capital. In this day and age, and especially in the current environment, where do you see most of the venture capital investments moving towards?
In terms of stage or?
In terms of the types of companies and technologies, so platforms and therapeutic areas, those types of, so just to give the companies they're attending an idea of, where they're likely to invest.
Yeah, I think that in terms of the therapeutic areas, obviously the bigger markets are always hot, oncology and of course now infectious diseases. But I think in general, investors are looking for things that, and we can talk about platforms now or platforms later, but in general, investors are looking for things that have multiple applications, multiple shots on goal, as they say, so that in case there's a failure, it's not a total failure. There's always a plan B in the event that something doesn't work out for kind of the first attempt that they're going after. So yeah, I would say that in general, the kind of the broader the application of the technology, the better. Having said that, I think that there's a kind of general saying that startups don't die because of starvation; they die of indigestion, and not focusing enough on a particular thing. And so, if you have a platform technology and you're thinking about how to get investment, I think the idea is to not try to boil the ocean to do too many things with your platform, but certainly position it in a relative sort of sequential way to say that once we achieve this, then we can achieve this and we can achieve that. If we fail at the first one, there's always a second one that we can go after. And so at least it provides a story that investors can understand of the risk associated with that. And we can talk a lot about risk. I think that's it's an important part of understanding how to approach investors, is to understand how they view risk. And so, but I can return to risk in a little bit as part of a future question.
Thank you, Don. So Steve, I'd like to move on to angels, and also if you could maybe just briefly cover family offices and what they are and how they're different from traditional venture capital firms, and what might be some advantages and disadvantages there. And also for angels, the companies that they are interested in investing in, what kind of time horizon do they typically have? So I'll turn it to you.
Sure. So angel investors tend to get into companies at an earlier stage than venture firms. They tend to look for exits that are in the 3 to 5 year range. A lot of times the type of technologies that fit that sort of investment thesis are medical devices, diagnostics, healthcare, IT, less so pharma, drug discovery, because usually those kind of companies take a lot more time and investment in order to get to an exit. However, there are some caveats to that. There are certain types of therapeutics, for example, antibiotics, that can exit pretty quickly. And then there's repurposed drug deals and drug delivery deals that are also of interest to angel investors. But the point I want to make is that it's kind of an earlier stage, and angel investors want to get in. They want to get a pretty good sized piece of the company, and then they want to get an exit in 3 to 5 years. Family offices are they can act like angel investors, and they can act like venture investors. Family offices tend to focus on, there are a subset of family offices that focus on a certain therapeutic area. So for example, if there's a family who's had some significant healthcare issues in, say, cardiovascular disease, they might be focused on cardiovascular disease as an investment thesis. There are other family offices that are agnostic as to the type of investment they make, but they're more operating like a venture firm or an angel group. They're looking for a return in a certain amount of time. But those are, I think, Diane, those are the sort of the main comparisons between family office and angels.
Okay, thanks, Steve. And so, Kuldeep, I was wondering if you could speak from the pharma perspective as to what areas, I mean, I know each pharma may have a different strategy with regard to what therapeutic areas they're interested in, but are there areas that are, more emphasized now, and others that have kind of fallen by the wayside? Are there technologies that they're most interested in? Are they interested in diagnostics? So I should say that, we have companies that have research tools, diagnostics, devices, therapeutics, digital health. So we have a wide array of companies. So if you could speak from the pharma perspective as to which ones they might be interested in.
Absolutely. Yeah, Dan. So, let me first start off by saying that, broadly speaking, when pharmaceutical companies are looking to acquire assets or technology platforms and really, if you will, do a deal, it kind of broadly falls into three buckets. One of their main drivers is to complement their internal portfolio. They might have a portfolio that has, that is lopsided in terms of, late stage clinical development, and they are lacking mid stage and early stage development. So they'll go out and identify assets that they would want to pursue to get a more balanced portfolio. That's one category. A second category, which seems to be coming up fairly recently, is for pharmaceutical companies to get into new therapeutic modalities that they were not in. So, for example, cell-based therapy, gene therapy, and generally genomic-based medicines, I think, is a very good example where traditionally pharmaceutical companies were not experts and did not develop those kinds of therapeutics. And then finally, they like to acquire platform technologies that increase the efficiencies of R&D and drug discovery and drug development. And those broadly fall into categories like AI-based, machine learning-based drug discovery tools that would enhance their internal efforts in discovering novel entities and novel therapeutics. So that's what drives, most of big pharma. So the first category is really focused on establishing either a partnership to work on a program, and they will make an investment in a company, and they are becoming very creative in how they want to make those investments. They, in some ways, are learning from the venture world. They might put an equity stake in a company, and at the same time, perhaps establish an R&D collaboration. But I would encourage, a lot of the audiences who are entrepreneurs to really look at what a particular pharmaceutical company has in their portfolio, what their therapeutic area of speciality is, and then determine if what they have, what they're working on, is a complement, and then really use that decision to focus on which pharmaceutical company they would want to pursue. And then, as I said, when they are getting into new therapeutic modalities, usually it's an approach to acquire a company, really, do an M&A, and really put a lot of, if you will, dollars on the table to acquire companies. So there have been some very good examples, Diane, in that area where a company like Bayer bought AskBio, which is a gene therapy focused company. They didn't have any gene therapy expertise. Lilly acquired Prevail Therapeutics, and I had the pleasure to really be involved in that project. And there's many examples where cell-based therapeutic companies are being acquired, gene editing companies are being acquired. And then, there are partnerships then really that are focused on acquiring technologies for machine learning and data analytics. I mean, data analytics is becoming a very important component in drug discovery and clinical development. And there are partnerships where they are putting in, a lot of investment in working with companies to complement what internal capabilities they have. I'll leave one other thought, before we have a general discussion. I think pharmaceutical companies are also becoming very creative in how to engage, entrepreneurs. In terms of, for example, J&J, traditionally have had their internal venture capital group that really focuses on very strategic focused investments. They will invest in companies that they believe are going to yield, therapeutics or assets or platforms that are going to be of importance to them, 2, 3, 4 years down the road, where they are in a position to do a bigger deal with a company that they've made an investment in. Eli Lilly is an interesting company where they have formed venture partnerships where they really provide input to VCs, what kind of companies they feel they should invest in, with the notion that they can either influence where the investment goes, or they are setting themselves up so that they can watch the maturation of a venture that they have put some suggestions on, so that they can come back to that venture and really do a partnership or collaboration and acquire them. So they are becoming very creative in the types of investment mechanisms that they are deploying. Oops, sorry, you're on mute, Diane.
Yeah, thanks, Kuldeep. So Lolita, from the perspective of the non-pharma hospital sector, what areas of interest are of interest now?
Yeah, I would say I'll look at hospital and from a payer as well, and I give those two sort of perspectives. So hospitals, I would say sort of that community mission driven sort of way of looking at things. What is the community-based mission that we're looking into? And so for us and some hospitals that I've worked with, it's primarily saying, what are we seeing within the community that we're seeing some of the needs and what are they coming to us with? And so I would say maternal health has been something that I've been seeing for quite some time, has been sort of the drive of where they're looking into. So anything for maternal disparities, health disparities, they're looking into that. They're looking at some of these social determinants of health and looking more into food insecurity. They're looking at some of the homelessness and looking into those types of solutions as well. Then they're also looking into mental health, again, with the providers and some of the nursing and those that are leaving the industry as well. How do they deal with that in some of the workforce development? So you see some of those types of investments that are going on, COVID issues. So they're looking for those types of technologies. From a payer perspective, it's a little different. Something to understand about payers, very challenging to get into. Number one, all of them behave very differently. You look at the Blues plans, you've got 39 so that are different. You got maybe one for one state, and you've got several entities that might work together for several states. And so for them, you don't know how to access them. You don't know what their all needs are. And so when we work inside of them, the whole issue for them is what's going to reduce cost. And so for them is understanding member cost drivers, what is driving the cost within those communities and within those members. So you look at chronic disease, so diabetes. So you're looking for diabetes prevention, diabetes management platforms. Also mental health, even though COVID drove that and brought that into light as well. And then again, maternal health seems to be key for those types of, for payers as well. We also look at fraud, waste, and abuse platforms, AI, prediction platforms as well, particularly trying to identify high-risk members, how to engage with them. So those are some of the things that we see from a payer perspective. It's quite challenging in a way to deal with that because what I see for entrepreneurs is, well, how do you even engage the payer? How do you even know what that's about? Who do you even contact? And I think that's something that we'll talk about during this panel discussion as well, as how do you get inside of those entities? How do you know, who do you talk to, and how to engage with them?
Okay, thanks very much, Lolita. In the interest of time, we're going to actually have to move to the next section. So thanks very much for your perspectives on at least directing companies towards, what are the main areas where there's interest. So the next question has to do with timing. And so I'm going to ask a general question to each of the panelists first. So there's interest in understanding, when a company should seek dilutive funding and what are the advantages and disadvantages of non-dilutive versus dilutive, and you have a combination. So there were a variety of questions around this topic. And so I was wondering if each of you could share your perspective on the timing of when you should seek it, and frankly, how long does it take for each type of investor? So when do you need to start looking? Some may be faster than others. So if you could give that perspective as well. And so I'll just go ahead and speak it at will.
So Diane, you want me to start then?
Sure.
Yeah, so it's never too soon to start. I think that this is a relationship business. It's a contact sport. And so having those relationships early on is extremely important, and start building those relationships. And those are hard to build. They're hard to find partners and find people who listen to your story. Investors like to see progress. And so showing them something very early and then coming back to them in a year saying, well, this is the progress we've made. I think that is encouraging for investors to see that sort of diligence and that sort of progress. In general, I think what we're looking for is proof of concept an animal model, a validated animal model is kind of would be kind of the first pass for the kind of the stage of company that we'd be interested in beginning that conversation. So that's kind of the short answer. So I know we're limited on time here, but that's in general the kind of stage that we're looking at on the pharma side. And then of course, and Steve can address this because he is working in areas that are shorter term, but certainly as you work into devices and diagnostics and healthcare IT, kind of in that order, they're looking for more market traction, more customer validation, things of that nature. So as you get into, for example, healthcare IT, you're looking for revenue. And then in the diagnostics medical device, then it's probably, pivotal studies or, key opinion leader acceptance and things of that nature. So those are kind of the broad stages of what we look at.
Thanks. And there were multiple questions from the audience about single asset therapeutics. I'll call so basically companies that have a single asset. When you talk about interest in therapeutics at the time of POC in an animal model, is that same true of a company that only has a single therapeutic, or is that more for companies with multiple shots on goal, different projects going on?
Yeah, I think that's a minimum kind of standard for getting interest. I think they just address that single asset question directly. In general, they're not as interesting to VCs, but if they're highly differentiated, then they could be. And especially if there's some interest from pharma. If pharma has shown some interest in a collaboration or some partnership, as long as that partnership deal isn't too restrictive, and Kuldeep can maybe address that. If you've got a pharma relationship and then come to VCs, well, it does on one hand provide a validation and a customer kind of in hand. On the other hand, if the deal is a little bit restrictive, then the VC may think, well, I've lost some optionality value by going into that single asset sort of situation with a partnership in place.
Sorry, Diane is on mute.
Okay. Kuldeep, let's move to you. Also, if you could address, while you're speaking about different types of the timing of different types of deals with pharma, whether it's an acquisition or maybe there's a partnership early. If you could talk a little bit about that too.
Absolutely, yeah. I'll reiterate, what Don just said. There sometimes there's no precise timing when to engage. You have to engage with a pharma company, a big pharma company, and establish, that dialogue and that relationship over time. And I'd like to call a spade. It does take a fair bit of time to really position your opportunity, your therapeutic, your platform with a pharmaceutical company. It goes through many different, if you will, filters before it really reaches to the individual or individuals that are the decision makers, that are really, the ones that are going to say yay or nay. And that usually takes a lot of time. And the stage of development, Diane, is really based on strategic fit. You will see that there might be a need from a pharma perspective of a clinical stage molecule, and for that, if it's filling a gap in their portfolio, they will move very quickly, especially if there is data and if it's a data-driven based, decision that they need to make. I think I forget who one of the panelists pointed out the focus on precision medicine and targeted therapeutics for oncology is a very good example, right? Where if the clinical development plan is clearly laid out and it's very clear, how a phase 1 study is going to be done. Having taken the time to really appreciate what the asset could do in a particular subset of, cancer patients, a big pharma who have an approach of pursuing something like that will move very quickly to do a deal. On the other spectrum, they are very early stage opportunities that pharma will invest in, where they're willing to wait 5 years, where they will partner with ventures and appreciate that there's an emerging area of science. Neuroinflammation, for example, is a good area. It's very broad, but there was the general notion that if you target neuroinflammation, that you have the potential to identify, disease-modifying agents, especially in neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's disease. But it was clear to pharma that the science is still in many ways immature. So they would have to make some sort of an investment, and usually the investment is influenced by companies, entrepreneurs, that are key opinion leaders that are at the cutting edge of science. So I'm not too sure if I answered your question. There really isn't any particular timing. It's really about the strategic fit and the interest of what they want to do. And look, they've become very, very creative in terms of figuring out when and how to invest in companies. I'll say one more thing before we move on to the other panelists. J&J, for example, has a very interesting model. They have an incubator facility now up to 12 or more, in the last count that I had. And they're actively investing in an infrastructure to incubate companies with the notion that they are waiting for them to mature. Sometimes even providing investments, certainly guidance and mentoring and coaching and consulting with a notion that they're going to do a deal with them, 2, 3, 4 years from now. So very, very different models today that pharma is pursuing in terms of investing in R&D and opportunities.
Thanks so much, Kuldeep. So Lolita, let's move to the hospital sector. Yeah. When do they typically invest in new technologies, diagnostics, et cetera?
Yeah, I would say, again, to the questions before and answers, soon for entrepreneurs out there, get in sooner rather than later, and don't wait, because it does take a lot of time to engage with hospitals and with payers as well. Number one, there is a chain of command, because again, not only if you go through, like with us, you have the innovation arms. Even with a hospital might have an innovation arm, but the payer might have an innovation arm. You can start there, but then that has to go, that's a process. And then that process goes through the channels, through maybe the CEO, through some other, VPs, other execs, business units. That takes plenty of time. I know of companies where they're on year 2 of working out a pilot deal. So again, do not spend and think, oh, I'm in with the innovation arm, I can do this within a week. No, it doesn't happen that way. So give it time. It's going to take time to get into there. My other thing is with this too, is once you're in, understand who your champion is once you get into it and stick with them. But the issue is, again, with them, is that people leave. So now you're starting back over again, and that could be another year or 2 before you actually start your pilot test. So you're back at ground zero once again. So it's just a process. I would encourage companies, again, there's no time that it takes. Like I mentioned, some companies are at year 2 at this process, and some move fairly quickly. I can stay for a couple of times. What we'll do is we'll try to develop the product internally ourselves, but once we find out there's manpower issues, capabilities are just not there, some expenses might be challenging, then we'll go out and try to source and identify it ourselves, find an accelerator, find a company, say, hey, can we partner and build this together? That might move it a little bit faster, but again, there's a channel, there's paperwork that needs to happen. That could take several months. So again, even if we go through that process, that takes time. So either way, it's just not a quick process. So once we start working, let's get it moving, but just be patient.
This is Kuldeep. I just want to, if I may please, make a quick comment that resonated that Lolita just mentioned. From a pharma perspective, finding that champion, that internal champion, that will look at your assets, your opportunity, your platform, and really sort of bat for you is a very interesting, I think, approach, a concept that I think the audience, they should be aware of. And that takes time, identifying that individual or individuals who you feel really believe in your, in your venture, in terms of what's going to deliver, what therapeutics is going to produce, sometimes makes a huge difference. And I can't agree more with you, Lolita, that, identifying a champion makes a huge difference.
Right. They're the ones who are going to go up the chain for you because you're not there. You're not working the business units. You're not inside. So if you have someone that can do that for you on your behalf, it can move things along. It can move that paperwork to legal. It can move that paperwork to CEO. Anything can help.
And I'll just say that, I spent several years as a scientific licensor at GlaxoSmithKline. And, I just to share with everyone, when you are talking with someone inside one of these strategics, whether it's pharma or another type of strategic, if you have someone in the BD arm who is working with you, know that they are negotiating for you inside. Okay. So they basically negotiate in two different directions. And when they ask you for something, they ask you for slides, they need more data from you. They can maybe go into committees. You need to have a good relationship with them and respond quickly if you can, because they're going to bat for you inside and you can't see, none of that visible to you as the external company, but that, they're trying to basically make the deal work. So it's hard to see that from the outside, but that's what they're doing for you. So Steve, I just want to move on to the angels. We've already talked about the fact that they invest very early, about their time horizon. So I would like, there've been several questions from folks about the safes or convertible notes and how do those terms kind of affect, what are they and how do they affect future investment?
Sure. So a SAFE is it's an acronym for Simple Agreement for Future Equity. And basically what it is it allows the investor to put money into a company. In exchange for that investment, they get a right to invest in the company for equity at a later time when the company does an investment round. It's not a convertible debt. It's the right to invest at a future time. And so the terms of a SAFE, the terms would involve, we're going to do an equity round and the company valuation is going to be at a certain level. And therefore the per share price will be at a certain level. And so you as a SAFE holder can invest in the company under those terms. That can be good for the company and it can be good for the investor. It could have an impact, obviously, on the folks that would lead that future round. So if you sign a deal with an investor under a SAFE agreement and the company valuation is not the right evaluation for the person leading the future round, or if the stock price is too low for the SAFE holder and therefore unacceptable to a deal lead for the future round, that could negatively impact your ability to raise that future round. But I know that there's a lot of SAFE investments that are happening. And frankly, I've not heard of any of those kind of issues being a problem, but this is a relatively new thing that's been happening now just for a couple of years. And so I don't know that I really have any negatives to tell you about, but I think it's just you have to be careful that you don't sign a SAFE agreement that might have negative impacts on a future round of investment.
And what about if you have to do multiple angel rounds? If you have an angel investor and you take on other, what are the potential pitfalls or complications there?
Yeah, so generally the way the angel rounds work is that you have to get a lead investor, and hopefully it's an organized angel group with some sophistication. And that lead investor will negotiate with the company to develop terms for that investment. And the angel group may not be able to cover the entire round. And so the angel group will work with the company and will reach out to other angel groups around the country that they know and trust and that they think might be interested in participating in the round. And those angel groups can then come in and fill out the round that the company is looking for. That's the typical thing that's done. And there's a lot more of that going on now than there was 5 years ago. this whole business about syndicating angel rounds has really taken off in the last 4 or 5 years. So it's a very good way to go. But you have to be sure that you're working with a trusted angel group that everybody understands, and they know that they're a good investment group, and the terms are available for everybody to really look at.
And Don, from the VC perspective, do you have any comments on if someone's now transitioning into venture capital investment that has done an angel round or more than one angel round?
I would just echo some of the comments about valuation. And I think that either a safe or convertible note or the positives of those sorts of investment instruments is that they delay the valuation of the company to a future point when more has been demonstrated, and less risk some risk has been wrung out of the company, whether it's a proof of concept experiment, or whether it's a toxicology experiment, or whether it's a prototype development, or whether it's a pilot, whatever it is, whatever value creation milestone needs to be met. That value creation milestone can be met without setting a value of the company too early. So it's very convenient. People use them all the time, especially in the life sciences, where you have so much risk involved that anytime you can wring some of that risk out without setting the valuation, that's a good thing. Steve can probably speak to many situations where an angel group has invested and then VC has come in and the valuation expectations have been different, and it's been a very painful sort of experience for people. And so I think that, again, back to the kind of the sophisticated investors will know that. Sophisticated life science angel investors understand that where those valuation expectations are going to go. And so there's not going to be a lot of surprises, but you have to work with folks who've been in this game for a while.
And Don, while before we move on to outreach investor strategies, could you speak a little bit about corporate venture arms and how those work, and then do they invest with other traditional VCs? Are there any issues there potentially that can crop up?
Sure. Corporate venture arms vary in terms of structure and vary in terms of intent and purpose. They can be investing off the balance sheet of the company, and which they're really kind of in the corporate development world of the venture capitalist of the corporate parent, or they can be a completely separate venture capital arm with a fairly significant layer of confidentiality and communication between the venture firm and the mothership. And so that structure will determine to a certain extent how they act. So, for example, if the corporate venture arm is fairly independent of the parent, then they can do things like invest on a contrarian basis, invest in areas where the corporate arm, where the mothership would not invest in. And so they can take chances in areas that are outside of the current sort of therapeutic areas. By contrast, if they're in the corporate development, and they're very much in the corporation itself, then they are probably going to be lockstep with the strategy of the company in terms of therapeutic investments and things of that nature. Many corporate arms will invest for a variety of reasons. Some just want a seat at the table to be able to see what's happening in kind of the venture world and up and coming technologies, and they just want to have access to that information and see what's happening. Others are investing because they're interested in potential business development deals down the road, which could be a partnership or an acquisition. And so it's again a wide variety depending on how they're structured and kind of what their intent is. So it's important as you're approaching a venture arm to understand kind of where they're coming from, what their intent is. But Steve Hall is a good friend of mine, and he will tell you that his return on investment is minuscule compared to Lily's return on investment of terms of revenue. So they're not as focused on return on investment as compared to a traditional VC. And that does set up not necessarily conflict, but just set up different priorities in terms of what they're looking for in terms of a deal.
Okay, so thanks very much, Don. And I think now we're going to move on. We have about 15 minutes left, so we're going to move on to outreach and investor strategy, which there were a lot of questions about this, and I'll split it into who and how. And so I'd like to ask each of the panelists to comment on how do you identify and what do you mean, how do you determine what the best type of investor or what the right investor is, what's the best fit for your company, and what's the impact of who that investor is on the first money in, the impact of who that investor is. So I'll just open it up to the panel.
Well, let me start with that. So generally speaking, and I work with a lot of early stage companies, generally speaking, the first money in that's equity money is angels. And the reason for that is that it's a smaller amount, the companies are early, the valuations are lower, and they fit the investment thesis for angel groups. I would just submit that, so the definition of an angel investor, an accredited angel investor is somebody that has a certain wealth to them. And that's actually defined by the Securities and Exchange Commission. But so there's a lot of wealthy people that don't really understand investing, and they don't really understand how to work with a company. So I would advise people to work with sophisticated angels, either individuals or angel groups that understand how companies work and that can not only invest in the company, but also bring value to the company through advice and mentoring. And that's one of the things that angels do that most other investor groups are not able to do because of bandwidth and so forth. So back to you, Diane.
Other panelists, do you have comments?
Yeah, I mean, I'll make a quick comment here. I think when you're thinking about getting investment as an entrepreneur, from a pharma perspective, I mentioned earlier that, for example, J&J Innovation, they have J Labs, which is an incubator facility, and they welcome incubating companies. Companies will need some cash. Sometimes they have competitions, that you can participate in, and they might give you free incubator space for a year. But they give you that kind of, as you put it, that kind of angel sort of investment, help, where it gets your venture off the ground and hopefully get you that consultation, mentorship, and leverage expertise within J&J to really get you to the next inflection point. Once again, I'll say it again, and I've said this before, they're becoming very creative in how they can enable that very early stage investment, especially when they're focused on looking at very high risk but high reward investment opportunities.
Yeah, and I'll make a quick comment as well. I think for the hospitals that I worked with before, what they will do with some of the companies is at least try to get them in and say, hey, we've got some providers that we would like for you to work with, at least some pilot testing to go inside of the hospital. So they're not able, it's smaller funds that they sometimes are working with. And so that's what they try to do, is at least bring them in-house and give them the opportunity to at least test their products inside.
So Don, from as far as if a company is looking at, I was talking to several different VCs, what factors would you consider just from the company perspective as to what makes them the best investor for them?
So it's like the real estate agents say location, location, location. I would say differentiation, differentiation, differentiation. They're always looking for what makes you different. It's a very crowded field. There's lots of science out there. And how does your science, how does your technology, how does it differ from everybody else? What sets it apart? And that may sound like there's some risk associated with it. And there is. I mean, the venture capitalists are used to risk, but they are also looking for differentiation. And so anytime you can tell a story that helps set you apart from the rest of the field, that's kind of the first step. And then I think it comes down to being able to talk about the risk in real terms and talk about the risk in terms of what it takes to get rid of that risk, what it takes to mitigate that risk in incremental steps, and to be able to tell that story in a coherent way so people can understand very specifically where value is being created, where risk is being reduced, and how much money it takes to get to those points. And just having that story, that product development doesn't have to be completely granular, but it can't be, we're raising $20 million. It can't be that. It needs to be raising $20 million, and these are the 10 steps it's going to take us to get to an IND, or to get into man, or get through a phase 2A or 2B. You know, those are the stories that investors want to hear.
Okay, and I know we just have about 8 minutes left. So I think one of the key pieces of questions that many of the companies have asked is, you know, how do I engage with investors? How do I identify people in the various types of strategics or VCs or angels? How do I find them? And how do I get a warm introduction? So if I could just put those questions to the panel.
Yeah, you know, Dan, let me say something here, which is an interesting, very different, avenue of getting investors. There's a very interesting trend these days, I think. I think it started about 3 or 4 years ago, where a lot of the CROs that were working with big pharma and had the infrastructure to really do drug discovery, either small molecule or, you know, therapeutic antibodies, large molecules, they have now morphed into actually being, strategic partners. So what they will do is they'll, sometimes, reach out to new ventures that are really formed on emerging areas of science where, to Don's point, would have a very differentiating aspect if you were to pursue, a drug discovery program, and they will offer their resources and their infrastructure to the company, for an equity stake in the venture. And I think it's a very interesting model. There's a lot of there are some ventures that have spun out of these kinds of CROs that work very closely with the CROs. Sometimes to even provide enough capital to start, a venture. So, I mean, I would urge the audience and the entrepreneurs there to, look at these kinds of potential investment opportunities and avenues. Something that's very different, but that certainly is coming up these days. Oops, you're on mute again. Sorry, Dan.
Sorry again. So for pharma, how does someone, reach into pharma? How do you reach into business development? I mean, do you have any advice on that?
Yeah, I mean, with pharma, the engagement really happens more so at partnering forums, and I cannot imagine what the pandemic has done in terms of not having that face-to-face, opportunity to meet with big pharma. Usually, JP Morgan and Bio and these forums, these events are usually the places where you make that first contact, with big pharma, and then you start that whole process that we talk about, where over time you develop a relationship. I would encourage investors to really try to, attend some of these virtual bio-partnering meetings that now are in place. Sometimes it's not easy, doing this virtually because, there's nothing as good as a face-to-face meeting to really get a feel for, someone who's starting their new venture, and, do they really have what it takes to, bring it to fruition.
So Lolita, I'll move to you. Do you have any comments on how people can?
Yeah, I know. To Kuldeep's point, it's harder now. Without those meetings, you can go to a conference and introduce yourself to the panelists, and hey, this is what I'm trying to do. it was so much different. But I think now I encourage folks, if you're particularly looking at hospitals and for payers, check out the innovation arms of each of those and reach out to them. That would be your first bet. Now, not all payers and not all hospitals have innovation arms. Some of them do. That means that'd probably be a good one to go into because they're most likely looking for someone like you. And they're probably a little bit more innovative, a little bit more progressive. So try that. But another thing is sometimes the chief medical officers might be someone to reach out to, or the product directors. If you're kind of a senior care product, look at Medicare Advantage product directors. Also the venture arms of some of the payers as well in some of the hospitals. That's what I would do. But you still have to put yourself out there, even in this virtual world, and look at some of the social platforms and just reach out to people. But, you're still going to have to put yourself out there and just be uncomfortable at times. And yes, you'll have a lot of no's, but you're still going to have to put your foot out there. But I would say if you're looking at hospitals and payers, look at the innovation arms and reach out to them.
Diane, let me just say quickly, for angel investors, go to the Angel Capital Association website. So it's angelcapitalassociation.org. And if you go there and look at under members, they break out the members, the member angel groups of the ACA, where they're located. And you can go to their websites and you can go and see what kind of investments those angel groups make. Angel groups tend to like to invest locally, although that's not a requirement, but it gives you a place to start. And I would recommend, if you're interested in angels, go there, find angel groups that are doing healthcare investing in your region and contact those angel groups.
Okay. Don?
Yeah, I'll just say that in terms of getting in contact with venture capital firms, the first thing is to look at what they're investing in. So first place I would start in any VC firm is their website and see what they've invested in. And it can either tell you one or two things. They've invested in a bunch of areas that are similar to yours, in which case they've already made their bets in whatever that area is, or they've made some bets and they're going to continue to make some bets in those areas. And so you don't know which, but you can maybe sort that out. I would also think about contacting some portfolio companies for two reasons. One, how is their experience in working with that venture firm? And secondly, if someone could give you a warm introduction or even a lukewarm introduction back to the partnership, that's a way to get in. There's one way that you can guarantee that no one will ever read your business plan or slide deck, is that's to send it to the website itself. Those will never be looked at, so don't do that. Try to get an introduction somehow to a partner, either directly through one of these forums or through perhaps a portfolio company or a venture partner or a portfolio company board seat, perhaps that person could help you get to that group. And most VCs are willing to do a half-hour introductory call if they feel like it's even within the right stage and the right therapeutic area for that firm, because they're interested in learning about all these different areas, quite frankly. They want to know what's going on. So a 30-minute call is not a big deal, and who knows where that'll go. So you'll usually get that sort of receptivity from a lot of folks.
And one question that came out yesterday from one of the audience members, it was, as you know, there are several VCs that are only focusing on company creation at this time. Is it beneficial should you contact them? Can it be beneficial to contact them, or are there pitfalls to contacting them about your technology?
Yes and no. I think the venture creation thing sounds good on paper. Some can do it if they're really big firms, but venture creation is a very heavy lift for a firm. And so there's only a certain number that they can do because it just sucks down partners' times big time. And so they just don't typically do that many of them unless they're, Third Rock or some very large firm that can handle, that many venture creation opportunities. But if you're going to do venture creation, the reason they're doing venture creation is to get in early and to own a lot. And so that's the flip side, is that if you can do SBIR grants and other things to de-risk your technology and create some value, then as a founder, you're in a much better position to ask for a higher valuation for your company compared to a venture creation opportunity.
And I'll just comment that I actually was mentoring a company that was actually absorbed into one of these companies that was being, one of these a company that was being created in a certain area, they decided that they were happy with the company being absorbed. So that can happen if it's in the space that they're already interested in. So, okay, so I want to thank the panelists, and I'm going to turn it back to Monique. The panelists have done a wonderful job, and I hope that the audience found the discussion useful. So Monique.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to all of our panelists and to all the participants who stayed on with us. We really appreciate all of your time and energy and all the questions you shared. I did want to encourage you to stay connected with us and to visit us at the NIA SBIR website. We did include several chat messages to you all from my colleague. I will note that we'll send a thank you note with some of these links included, but you can also save the chat in case you would like to do that. By clicking the 3 dots on the chat window at the bottom, and that will allow you to save it if you'd like. We'll also be sending some of these out. It does depend on what level of Zoom that you have, so we can also chat some of those out and email them as well. I also want to share the NHLBI contact information, just so you know that if you are an NIA or NHLBI awardee, you can have a direct conversation with some of our EIRs and get more specific information answered about your situation. I'm also sharing the SEED information. That is the NIH SBIR contact information. There are lots of resources as well, and videos and how-tos. Please also visit us to check out the past curriculum topics for the webinar and register for the next session. Thank you all for your time. I will include the link in chat again to register for Investing Funding Part 2. So you have that, and please do fill out the feedback form. Thank you so much for your time and your energy. Follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter. Set up a one-on-one meeting with us. We're here to help you be successful. All right. Thank you, everyone.